Friends, this summer, Elizabeth and I are embarking upon a journey through stories that give meaning and depth to our lives as Christians. Not only biblical stories, but also stories that might not seem overtly religious, stories that feel secular, but end up having deep religious significance. I spent this past week working in the mountains for a Montreat youth conference. While I was there, I was working, and I was also working on my sermon, working on writing this sermon. Being around a bunch of pastors means that when you say the phrase, "I'm going somewhere to work on my sermon," they don't all give you a wary look and move out of the room slowly. They ask you what you're writing about. They ask you what you're preaching on, with an unbelievable amount of interest. So I got the chance to tell them that one of the texts I was preaching on was a children's book. One of my colleagues is a part-time librarian and a friend. When I told her about this series, she talked about her love for children's books. And one of the things that she said that stuck with me was she loves children's books that have complexity built in, that remind us that being a child is a complicated thing. I know that I forget that all too often, but I'm reminded of that when I read one of my favorite children's books. I'm not sure that you can appreciate how excited I am to talk about where the wild things are in a sermon. It's basically a dream come true for the 5-year-old in me. Max is a young child who is full of energy. He enjoys running around and making a ruckus, especially when he puts on his new wolf suit. So Max donned his wolf suit and did what he did best. He made some terrible noise. He chased around the dog, and he got sent to his room with no supper. As I said, surprisingly similar to my childhood. Max was so mad, and he wanted so badly to get away. He wanted to be somewhere else. And suddenly, his room had turned into a jungle, and a boat carried him away. Far, far away to where the wild things are. The wild things were scary at first as they roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. But Max tamed them when he looked into their eyes without blinking once. For a time, Max was certainly happy with the wild things. They had good times together, joining in the wild rumpus. But soon, Max realized that he was lonely, and he wanted to be with someone who loved him best of all. So he decided to return home. He sailed back to his room. And when he arrived, his supper was waiting for him, and it was still hot. Even as I was growing up, I loved this story. I liked the fact that the main character's name was so close to mine. And it had a main character who had an adventurous spirit, a spirit that I wanted to have, with as active an imagination as I had. I liked that Max got into all kinds of mischief. I liked the idea of the fantastic creatures, and I loved the illustrations. The wonderful sweeping pictures of Max, the wild things, and the wild rumpus. This is similar to a drawing which Thora Kildee has done for us today that you can find in your bulletin. When I saw her drawing of Max and the wild things, it brought all the happy memories back. This is obviously a story of nostalgia for me. It is also a story full of deep meaning. From Max's desire to escape his world for another experience, to the way Max tames the wild things by looking into their eyes, to my favorite little detail, and the one which stands out today, that when Max returned to his supper, it was waiting for him, and it was still hot. Such was his welcome to the place where someone loved him best of all. Such was his welcome home. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to the father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So the father divided his property among his 2 sons. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. And I will get up and I will go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he arose and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran out and put his arms around his son and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" The story of the prodigal son may be a familiar one, and the story itself is so complicated and beautiful that it needs little explanation. The younger son, like Max, leaves his family behind in almost a spiteful way. By asking his father for the inheritance, he is essentially saying to his father, "You are dead to me." He sets off in search of an adventure, and an adventure he has. He may not have met beasts with rolling eyes and gnashing teeth and sharp claws, but the prodigal son soon finds himself in a place of despair, hungry and lonely. After all of his searching, after his seeking for that which was not to be found, he finds himself in a desperate situation. So often, the search turns out fruitless. So often, we discover ourselves in the midst of a foreign place, a foreign circumstance, a foreign relationship, looking for something we couldn't find before. And so often, we are unable to find that something. So often, the life that we set out to live doesn't turn out to be the life worth striving for. So often, the wild rumpus leaves us unfulfilled. You may remember a time in your life when you were engaged in such a search. You may find yourself in such a search now, looking for something more, hoping or longing or struggling for meaning. Or you may yet to begin that search. But it is one that we all find ourselves in at one point or another. An attempt to make sense of the world, an attempt to understand our purpose, what it is we are meant to accomplish, why God has set us on this troublesome path called life. Both of our stories today reach a turning point. The prodigal son finds himself feeding unclean animals, wishing he could share their meal. He comes to himself, realizes his sins, regrets his choices, and resolves to return to his father and seek forgiveness, to be where he is loved. Max sits alone after the wild rumpus and realizes that he is lonely. He realizes that the wild things don't truly love him. They are simply terrible beasts that fear him. He comes to himself. He realizes that he wants to be where he is loved. So Max and the prodigal son turn back. They turn away from their searches. They turn back to whence they came, and returning to their home, they find what was missing. They find welcome. They find love. They find grace. Perhaps this is true for us as well. Perhaps the conclusion of their journeys sheds some light on the conclusion of our journeys too. We search and we search. We have experiences, we grow, we change. The journey may not necessarily be a bad thing. Perhaps the prodigal son needed his foreign excursion to understand his father's love. Perhaps Max needed to feel the loneliness of the terrible wild things to appreciate the love of a simple, warm meal. In the end, perhaps we find ourselves longing for what it was we find at home. These stories, as much as they speak to us as individuals, may speak to our churches as well. Our denomination, our faith tradition, our individual churches are feeling the strain of modernity. The world is becoming more secularized. People think differently about what regular membership means. We constantly hear about churches closing their doors. The church itself seems to be out wandering, searching for meaning, searching for identity. Who are we? How do we survive? What will the church of the future look like? Perhaps we need to read Max's story. Perhaps we need to read the prodigal son's story, to be reminded that what we are searching for can be found at home. What we're searching for can be found in the grace of God, a grace that runs out to meet the estranged son, a grace that leaves out supper waiting to be found, still hot, a grace that reminds us that we love because God first loved us. John Newton was an English sailor in the late 1700s. He had a very difficult life. Newton was forced into service in the Royal Navy. When he tried to escape that service, he was captured and punished as a deserter and was abandoned. He eventually ended up on a slave ship fueling the slave trade between Britain, Africa, and the Americas. While sailing off the coast of Ireland, Newton's ship was caught in a terrible storm. He woke in the middle of the night to find the ship filling with water. He cried out to God in fear and panic and found his ship brought through the storm. Following this experience, Newton became a Christian, and eventually he left the slave trade to become an abolitionist. Newton reflected on his life before and after the storm. He wrote many interesting observations about his search for God and the way that God brought Newton home. He once wrote, "I am not what I ought to be. I am not what I want to be. I am not what I hope to be in another world, but still, I am not what I once used to be. And by the grace of God, I am what I am." I think that this is what might have gone through the prodigal son's head when his father ran out to meet him. I think that this is what might have gone through Max's head when he found his supper waiting for him, still hot. I am not what I want to be, but I am not what I used to be. By the grace of God, I am what I am. Newton's most famous words also echo this sentiment. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. I once was lost, but now I'm found. It's God's grace that found Newton in that storm. It's God's grace that the prodigal son encountered in the father who ran out to embrace his youngest son. It's God's grace that Max found in the supper in his room. God's grace is the warm embrace of home. It is the comfort in which we rest. It is the place where we know we are safe, where we are known, where we are loved, not in spite of who we are, but because of who we are. This is what the prodigal son found at the end of his search. This is what Max found at the end of his search. This is what we find at the end of our search. Home. Amen.